For a quick introduction, my name is Rachel Smith. I'm the president and CEO of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. I also like to say that I'm recovering from government. I spent about 15 years working for King County Executive Dow Constantine, Sound Transit, and former Mayor Greg Nichols. So know a lot of the sort of government sides of transportation very well. Also really pleased to be joined by Washington State Department of Transportation Secretary Roger Millar. There he is. On the screen, Jim Restucci, who is the Washington State Transportation Commissioner, also a Sunnyside City Council member. He also served as mayor for many years, and president and CTO for Access Corporation. And then right here joining me on the stage is Kent Keel. Kent wears many hats. He's the Sound Transit Board Chair. He is the president of the Association of Washington Cities, and he is a University Place City Council member. So really looking forward to the conversation with these great folks today. So before we sort of get just quickly into questions, just a couple of things I'll say to set us up. First, the theme that you're hearing and you'll continue to hear in our conversation is change was coming well before the pandemic. That continues to be true in transportation, and like all things, the pandemic really did speed that up. But that change was coming, and it's been coming in a lot of different ways. First, thinking differently about how we're connecting communities. I'm a transit person, so that's typically how I think about these things. But, the all-day network for transit, not just commuter hours, getting people to and from work, transit dependency, and especially for those essential workers who've continued to work during the pandemic, and, transit to get to recreation and do other things just besides just getting to work and getting back home to your families. There's another theme that you just heard from the former panel that's also true here for transportation as well, which is integration. Integration of the systems, whether it's transit systems, highway systems, ferry systems. How do we make that integration seamless so that people can use the transportation system to do all the things that they need to do and not just get to and from work? And then finally, how are we going to fund it all? How are we going to fuel it all? And those are all the questions that we'll be talking about today. So to get us started, Kent, why don't we start with you, and let's just talk a little bit about that change. What have we been seeing in your role, sort of seeing it from a number of different perspectives in use of the system?
Great, thank you. It's good to be here with you all today. The thing about the change that's happened most recently, we've heard it in a lot of the panels. I mean, with the pandemic, at Sound Transit, the ridership just dropped. I mean, it went from a whole lot to almost no one. And it really impacted the way that we had to deliver that service and how we had to pay for their service and all those things. And so that is the biggest thing that we saw. And there are some other things that because of ridership and because of how the patterns changed, there's some things on the back end as far as operationally and all those things that have changed, and we can get into some of that, but that's the biggest thing up front.
Yeah, and I think that is true of probably all of our transit systems have seen that same thing. Roger, why don't you tell us a little bit, sort of same question in terms of the changes that you've seen sort of system-wide?
Well, one thing that's really important to remember, when the pandemic hit, we delivered. The highway system continued to work. We kept the safety rest areas open. We worked with the trucking community to get food to people and to get emergency workers where they needed to go, healthcare workers and the like. We kept the Washington State ferries up and running. We kept the intercity rail up and running, and we worked with transit agencies around the state. So we are an agency that responds to crisis and threats to our assets. And what's different about this particular threat is the asset that it threatens is our team, the greatest asset that we have. And so we've had to, half of our people went home to stay healthy, and they're still at home. And they're very productive. And what's interesting is they like it that way. They all want to go back to the office and see their colleagues, but 75% of them want to commute from home, want to telecommute 3 days or more a week. That is something different. The pandemic showed us the importance of essential workers and really highlighted for us the disparities between, those on the team that can go home and those on the team that have to be on the front line. And if you think about that writ large on our economy and our population, that's a huge, huge issue. I mean, everything that we do, we look at through a climate change lens and an equity lens. And the pandemic is, a part of a larger, crisis and longstanding and long-lasting crisis in the world. The equity issues have been really, really brought to the forefront with a lot of other things.
And Roger, just to sort of echo the change was coming, I think you had said something like pre-pandemic system usage was 85% other or something like that.
It's the stuff we assume and the facts. Everybody assumes that our highways are packed because people are commuting to and from work. The commute is about 16% of our traffic. 85% of the traffic on the highway is not people commuting from home to work and from work to home. And now with people at home, teleworking, traffic is about 4% below where it was in March of 2020. But the pattern in terms of where the traffic is at different times of day is changed radically because of the pandemic. And it'll be interesting to see if it stays that way. We really have no morning peak anymore. The traffic grows over the day because, half the population is working at the kitchen table or the home office, and then they get up mid-morning and they run an errand or go to a meeting. And so how do you respond to that as an agency that deals with automobiles like we do? How do you respond to that as an agency that deals with van pools and buses and ferries, which we do? How do you modify your service model in response to what we've learned from the pandemic and what the pandemic has shown us about the modern work environment and how maybe it's a little different from back when Leave It to Beaver was on the air.
And I think it's similar to the last panel where we talked about sort of knowledge is key, on student debt, for example. Same thing I think here's a transportation system is, yes, we do have commute hours, but that is not exclusively what we're seeing in terms of our transportation usage. So, Jim, your vision is a lot longer. As on the Transportation Commission, you're often looking 15, 20 years out. So, talk to us a little bit about, sort of the changes that you've seen and the changes that you are planning for as a commissioner.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and wonderful to be here today, and great to be on this panel with my colleagues. I think one of the things we need to be mindful of is the fact that we fund our transportation system in this state based on the 49.4 cent per gallon gas tax, right? And we know for a fact that by 2035, there's going to be a 50% reduction in that. So I think we need to, when we start looking at the future, 20 years from now, we have to realize that combustion fuel engine vehicles are not the future, right? I mean, the top three have already told us at the Arch 21 conference this year, all three of the big three automotive manufacturers have given us years certain as to when they're going to stop producing combustible engines. I think that's something that we need to be mindful of, in state government. I don't believe that state government's going to drive this. It's going to be commercial industry that drives this. So we need to be prepared for that. That's why the State Transportation Commission has been working for 5 years on a road usage charge program. We ran a pilot for a year, determine whether or not how that would work, including using real money between Oregon and Washington to see how that would work. So I think that's the future. I mean, if you want me to talk about the real future, I think it's Jetsonian, right? I think it's eVTOLs are coming. Electric vertical takeoff and landing craft are coming. I think that's the future of transportation. And the commission has recognized that, the highway of the future is the internet, and therefore transportation dollars need to be used to fund the internet, right? I think that's another thing that we've talked about and made recommendations to the legislature on. So, and then the last thing I would say is, we have to be mindful of the deficits that we have with prevention and maintenance. The commission has traveled around the state and heard from city councils, commissions, regional transportation policy boards that, there's a huge deficit in their maintenance and preservation programs. And we need to be mindful of that because, as Roger will tell you, you can only push that off for so long before now you have to replace the road. And so I think that's a big deal.
That's great. And you hit, Jim, on a couple of things that we want to talk about here in a minute in terms of funding and fueling. But before we get to that, so we sort of identified that change. I think it'd be great to talk a little bit about what changes need to be made to the system to respond to what we're seeing now. And, Roger, you've talked about sort of like mobility on demand and, some of the things that we're seeing transit agencies try, like, getting short rides to transit with using partnerships with Uber and Lyft and Via and things like that. Talk a little bit about the changes as you see what needs to happen over the next few years.
Well, that's a great question, and it gives me a chance to go on a little roll here on some stuff.
Good.
We as an agency have a reputation as being really good at building stuff, and the bigger the better. The longest bridge in the world, the longest floating bridge in the world, the widest deep bore tunnel in the. We do that kind of thing. But what we've done for the people we serve is we've built about $200 billion worth of stuff that we really need to look at our mission as being stewards of that resource as opposed to builders of projects. And we need to recognize, and we all need to recognize, that the solution to every problem is not a wider highway or another interchange or what have you. And that's been the past. The future, to me, as secretary, we need to preserve the asset that we own. Our economy doesn't run on the infrastructure we wish we had. It runs on the infrastructure that's out there right now, and we can't take it for granted that it's going to be there. Look at the Ship Canal Bridge, look at the Vantage Bridge. I hate looking at the Columbia River through the Vantage Bridge deck, but you can do that on occasion, and that's bad. We need to address safety. We talk about the impact of congestion on our economy. It costs the Washington economy about $5 billion a year. Crashes cost the Washington economy over $15 billion a year, but we don't address crashes the way we address congestion. We need to be thinking about how do we get more throughput from the stuff we have. The concrete and steel, it's all out there. The asphalt, how do we move more people, more goods, more services? How do we manage demand for those systems? If 40% of the trips we take every day are less than 5 miles in length, if 30% of the trips we take every day are less than a mile in length, why do we take most of those trips in a car? We take most of those trips in the car because we've designed a system that makes that trip safe for you if you're in the car. But woe be it to you if you're what we call a vulnerable user, which is somebody walking or somebody riding a bicycle. So we need to look at that active transportation infrastructure, not as an amenity, but as a demand management tool that frees up capacity on our highways for the things that need to be out on our highways. And then we need to add capacity. At a local level, we need to add transit capacity. We need to add walking and biking capacity. At a regional level, we need to add public transportation capacity. At a mega regional level, we really need to be talking about high-speed rail in our future.
Great.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in. Thanks, Roger, for that. I couldn't agree with you more about your comments. And if I could put my Association of Washington Cities hat on.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you to do. So perfect.
Okay. At this time, this whole deal about infrastructure and maintenance, one of the big things that cities need very much so when it comes to transportation is that those dollars to maintain the streets and the intersections and the lights, traffic lights that are in our cities. I mean, it is difficult, to say the least, for cities to maintain those things because the funds aren't there and the mechanisms to gain access to resources to do that aren't there, and we need to really pay attention to it. And I really like the notion of this also this I call it the last mile kind of a deal where you, if I could toggle back to public transportation, where you have folks that are maybe at home and trying to get to public transportation. Oftentimes it's not easy. I mean, not every bus stop is right outside your house or train stop or anything, and so typically what people have to do, they end up getting in their car and drive to where the public transportation is, either some big, huge parking garage somewhere. Roger, I know you love that, or some other place. And so there really needs to be some consideration about how do we address that last mile. And one of the things happened to me on Pierce Transit as well as a commissioner there, we did within Pierce Transit is that we did do that, partner with Lyft and Uber to say, look go to the person's house, pick them up, and take them to the bus stop, so they don't have to get their car. And we worked out some things around that. Two other points, and I'll stop. I really like the notion, Jim, that you raised, and I wanted to raise it too, is that really looking at technology and broadband and the internet as a part of transportation. I mean, and my background is technology. That's what I do for my day job. And those in that field know that when we talk about networking, we actually talk about, there's something called a transport layer, in technology. And I think that if we were looking toward the future, is that we really need to start looking at that that broadband as a transportation, particularly if we're talking about hybrid and all those kind of things like that. So anyway, I'll stop there.
That's great. And I think, sort of weaving some of that together, part of the challenge is that, we invest heavily in these large pieces of infrastructure, whether it's light rail, whether it's highways, whatever. And we do not invest in connecting people to them, and that's, that is oftentimes either an afterthought or a second thought or, sort of small ball solutions. And I think we need to actually be thinking big about how we connect people to all of that infrastructure that you and Roger and others have built. Jim, sticking with that theme for just a moment, you've said something that I think is excellently provocative, which is that we should be spending transportation dollars on, technology. Talk a little bit more about your sort of thoughts on that and, the other kinds of investments that you think we need to be making to really make the changes to the system that we want to see.
Thank you so much. It actually comes down to two different things that the commission heard over the last couple of years because of COVID. One being the fact that, the rural versus urban, the fact that, with kids not being able to attend school, they had to have a virtual way to get to school. And what we found was that, our systems that were in place in urban areas were not the same in rural areas, and that there were not enough dollars to provide the kind of bandwidth solutions that were needed for, a house with 3 kids in it all trying to attend school at the same exact time. That's what we heard from city councils and commissions, in regions throughout the state. And so when the commission looked at it, we said, if you think about it, in the future, you travel right now on the internet to go places, right? You actually get a feel of where you're going before you go there. So it's not really a big step for us to think that, the internet is the highway of the future. I mean, it's been called that already. I can't claim that. So I think that's really where the commission saw it. And then when it comes to the rural versus urban, and Roger and I have had this conversation on more than one occasion. We have to be mindful that we cannot fund rural like we fund urban, or the same way, that they are two different animals, but that we have to fund them all together. There's 4.1 million miles of rural roadway in the United States, and 45% of all fatalities happen on rural roadways. So it's important for us to be mindful of how we fund the transportation system when we look at it overall in one piece. And so I think adding the internet to that is not a broad reach, if you will.
We will, and I think that's right. And I think so fascinating that is what you heard from the public, right? That is not something that we, as leaders are pushing for. That is something that's coming into us as leaders. And so I think that's really important. The other thing I would just add to sort of this part of our conversation is, there is a big component here for business as well. And that, means us talking about what the future of work is going to look like, what our expectations of our employees are going to be going forward, how flexibility is being incorporated into talent retention, and that is all evolving as we come out of the pandemic. And I think how that evolves is it necessarily needs to be tied to the kinds of investments that we make in our transportation system. And I think the other piece is obviously the land use and sort of downtowns and repurposing buildings. All of that is work in progress, but it's going to need to inform what we decide to do, not just at the local level, but at the regional and state level as well. So let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about funding. And I think, the interesting thing is, and Jim, you talked about the gas tax already, and I think it's, not surprising to anybody in this room that that's not the conversation of the future. And so what is, there's carbon pricing, there's usage charges, there's so much out there, plus all the federal dollars that are also coming into communities right now. So Roger, why don't we start with you? I'm sure you have the most to say about it.
Well, sure. The Washington State DOT, we have a $4 billion a year budget. About 12% of our budget is federal money. The rest of the money is raised right here in Washington State, and we spend it here in Washington State. But when you look at our state's transportation system as a whole, as much of it is funded by property tax as is funded by gas tax. And it's funded by sales tax. It's funded by all the different ways we fund government when you look at what cities do and what counties do and what the state. And it's a lot of money. But that $4 billion that we spend every year on the Washington State DOT, Washingtonians get a return on that investment in terms of the economy, quality of life, access to opportunity. What concerns me is the costs of not investing in transportation. We'll talk about how we make that investment, but the cost of not investing, when you look at the combination of congestion and crashes and car repairs because our roads aren't in a state of good repair, and the impact of greenhouse gases on our economy, it's a $25 billion a year drag on Washington's economy. And people complain about the 49.4 cent a gallon gas tax. If you wanted to raise $25 billion a year, you're talking about a gas tax in the range of $6.88 a gallon. That is the cost to Washington families and Washington taxpayers of not making smart investments. Now, the thing about the gas tax, Jim's absolutely right. Fewer gas and diesel powered vehicles, less gas tax being collected. We need to figure out, as we change our propulsion technologies, how are we going to pay for this? People don't like tolls. People don't like congestion pricing. People don't like road user charges. If you ask them, they don't like gas taxes either. People don't like taxes. We have to show people that they're getting a return on their investment, and that alternative to investing, paying for it through sitting stuck in traffic, paying for it through deaths and injuries on the highway, property damage, paying for it through car repairs, and paying for it through the planet warming because of how we do business.
And Kent, you touched on this just a moment ago, sort of at the local level. Do you want to say a little bit more about, sort of what you hear from your colleagues in terms of appetite and need, and what funding options seem like the right ones?
Yeah, thank you for the question. At the local level, cities really, as I did say before, are struggling with paying for roads, and all the things that Roger talked about, sales tax and the like. It is not a good model for us because as we saw during the pandemic, when people stopped buying things, the dollars into the cities and into government went down, and so you couldn't take care of your roads. And so we need to have, I believe, a more stable funding structure for transportation. And as we all know, probably in this room, the state legislature is wrestling with that even at this moment. So much so that, for the last 2 years, they've been talking about having some special session just to talk about transportation funding. And so I don't, I mean, we've talked with different legislatures about different kinds of ideas. There are all kinds of ideas, a line list of things. And so it really, in my view, comes down to what is the appetite for the legislature to fix it. I mean, the tools are there. But you know, it's politics, you know, and I can say that I'm a politician, and it is it's difficult when you start talking about taxes, depending upon who you're talking to, and it changes, who's for or against different ideas, but the tools are there in the toolbox in our state. And my hope is that we can all acquiesce around a set of tools that will stabilize the funding for what we need.
Well, here to that. And I think, you know, certainly on behalf of the business community, transportation continues to be the most important issue for us. And, you know, we also want to see those tools and those investments made. So, Jim, just sticking with funding here, you know, again, you've got that 15, 20-year horizon as you look out. What do you think is the future for funding the system?
Oh, good question, right? I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you, Kent brought up a good point, and that is, you know, as a city councilman, you know, when I have to fund a program, I look for sustainable funding, right? So for me, I'll take everybody back here in the room 15, 20 years ago when, and Kent can tell you too, when we were wrestling with the whole E911 and emergency medical services fees on landlines, right? I mean, the majority of people had a telephone line in their home, and that landline, we had the phone companies collecting a charge in order to pay for those services. But as more and more people dropped their landlines and went to cell phones, we weren't able to collect those taxes anymore. So those programs failed. We had to find another way. And of course, you know, we did find another way going through, you know, a number of large cities went into a legal battle with the cellular phone companies, and we were able to get them to start collecting those fees. And if you look on your cell phone bill today, you see those charges go right to your local city. Whatever city you live in gets those for E911 and for emergency medical services, things of that nature. So I think when we look at the future, we have to come up with a sustainable funding program, right? We need to look at that. If over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to see a 50% reduction in gas tax, then we've got to come up with an alternative. I think RUC is definitely something that we need to look at, right? I don't know if it's the answer. I've heard a lot of people talk about different ways that we could do it, and I've heard legislators talk about raising the gas tax. You know, we could raise the gas tax another 15 cents or something of that nature, and probably fund a lot of these programs that we want over the next decade. But that's going to be it. At that point, we'll be out of money again. So we've got to come up with a solution that's sustainable for the future. And I believe that's electric vehicles and road usage charging.
Well, let's stick on the electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles for a minute. And Jim, stay with you. What does that system need to look like statewide? I mean, you've talked about how you know, the infrastructure that we have today, you can't even get everywhere you need to go if you have an electric vehicle. So talk a little bit about that sort of fueling the system at the same time as we're funding it.
Well, it really depends on which direction we want to go, right? I mean, right now, the AV Work Group Committee, which I chair for the commission, you know, we have 34 members of the committee, including 4 members of the House and 4 members of the Senate. You know, they met 3 times in 2021, and we have 7 subcommittees, and they met 20 times. And none of us came up with any real answers, obviously. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, but we did hear from 3 pilots, right? We heard from Utah, we heard from Minnesota, and we heard from Michigan. And I believe that's the next step for us, is we need to take a look at running a pilot here in Washington State, an autonomous vehicle pilot, so that we can determine the next steps from there. Because it's all going to depend on what type of roadside infrastructure we need to purchase and things of that nature. And there's a lot of involvement, right? A secure credential management server and solution that needs to be run so that the vehicles can communicate with each other securely. A lot of stuff behind the scenes, a lot of technical stuff, obviously high level technical stuff that still hasn't been worked out. You know, increases in technology like, you know, better LiDAR and things of that nature are going to make the systems work better. But at the same time, we're going to have statutes and regulations in place to govern that type of stuff. And I don't think we're going to be able to do that at the state level. I think that's going to be, we're going to need to see a national push on that. And actually, Roger, this is a great segue to you. If I could ask you as Vice President of AASHTO, where do you see the AVs at the national level?
Well, it's a great question. At the national level, electric vehicles and automated transportation are right at the forefront. There's language in the bill. They're calling it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law now, no longer EJA, but there's language there for pilots. There's language to set up a national advisory committee. People will be working in that space and moving forward. I represent we call ourselves the infrastructure owners and operators in the conversations that are going on with the equipment manufacturers and the tech companies in the intelligent transportation space. I'm chair of the board of ITS America right now, and we're at our national conference talking about just that. But it's not just people driving cars, because a highway clogged with gas and diesel powered vehicles is a mess, but a highway clogged with electric vehicles is a cleaner mess, but a mess nevertheless. And a highway clogged with vehicles being driven by computers the same way. There's just the physics about the space and what we want to do with that space. In the world of automated vehicles, electric vehicles, we have to do that in the context of what are we doing from an equity perspective, providing people with affordable housing and transportation choices. We need to do that from a community planning space. What kind of world do we want to live in? Some of the people that are just like have the tech blinders on are like, great, autonomous vehicles, we won't need parking, so we can put 4 lanes of traffic on the street instead of 2. Well, how about narrowing the street up and providing places for people to walk or people to bike or people to sit outside and have lunch or have a glass of wine at the end of the day? We need to be thinking about, and my whole thing with the technology is we need to harness technology to achieve the societal goals we've identified for ourselves in terms of quality of life and equitable access to that quality of life and economic prosperity and environmental stewardship. We need to harness the technology. You were talking about the advanced aviation stuff earlier in that Jetsons world. In my really happy times, I think about the Jetsons, but I kind of have a dystopia meter, and the Jetsons are on one end, and then you kind of click over to the really bad Star Wars prequels in terms of the sky just full of cars, and then you go to Blade Runner, where just the rich people are in the sky full of cars, and everybody else is down in the steam. And then out at the end of it is Terminator. So just, whatever you do, don't call the new system Skynet, okay?
Great.
That's wonderful, Roger. I love it.
And so I think we'll do one more question and then can open it up to the audience. But my question, same one to all three of you, and I'll answer it first, is sort of like, what's the one thing that is either keeping you up at night or you need answers to, or is the nut you want to crack as you think about transportation and coming out of the pandemic? For me, and unsurprising because I'm an unabashed regionalist, is how do we continue to regionalize all parts of our system? We've done a great job with Sound Transit, because the reality is folks don't live their lives and do their business based on city or county boundaries. They live in Seattle and they go to the University of Washington in Tacoma. They, live in Bellevue and they work in Bothell. That is what we know is the reality. And so, we have such disparities in our cities in terms of transportation infrastructure, whether it's transit or bike lanes and sidewalks or roads and bridges. So how do we continue to regionalize, again, knowing that people are not going to continue to do this sort of 9-to-5 thing. They want options for all of the things in their lives. And so that's sort of the answer for me. It's how we continue to regionalize. Kent, how about for you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think for me, the thing that really keeps me up at night is my work at Sound Transit, and sticking with the regionalization theme. As you all know, it's a 3-county agency that is set to build the spine, and that's the thing that keeps me up. And it goes from Tacoma Community College in Tacoma, just right 1 block away from my city in University Place, all the way up to downtown Everett. That's what the spine is supposed to do, and we're building it, and there's some things going on to make that happen. But one of the things that I was able to do the 2 years I've been chair is actually lead the agency through realignment. And when the pandemic happened and we lost the sales tax dollars that we had to rethink building the spine, because the monies that we had projected and the bonds that we sold, they weren't there. And so now we have this realignment plan that's still not quite done. And so what's keeping me up at night is my ability to work with my 17 other colleagues on this regional committee to actually put the arms and legs on realignment so that it really turns out that we meet the expectation of the voters. And so there's that work that still has to be done. And so it's a little bit daunting.
Well, one, I think we need to trademark the spine because we talk about it like everybody knows what it is all the time. So we'll trademark that. Also, you're giving me PTSD because I worked at Sound Transit during the Great Recession and the realignment that we went through then. So I feel for you. Good. Jim, how about you? What's the one thing you want to know, see, or keeping you up at night?
Oh, lots of things keep me up at night. But right now, I think with autonomous vehicles, it's, we will not have the time before they will be here, and we will be, behind the 8 ball, if you will. So I think that's my thing is I want to make sure our state's at the forefront and that we are looking at the technology, that we're aware of what's coming down the pipe, and we're prepared to act upon it. And that means, from my position as a commissioner, to be able to make recommendations to the governor and the legislature on how we prepare for these systems.
Great. And Roger, I do know we have some legislators here in the room and watching, so choose your words.
I always do.
I know that you do.
I always do. The one thing that keeps me up at night is the condition of our greatest asset in transportation. And that asset is our people, the men and women of the Washington State Department of Transportation, or Sound Transit, or any other local transportation agency, our union brothers and sisters in the construction trades, our consultants. We run the Washington State ferry system. 75% of the captains of the ships are eligible to retire. Over half of the chief engineers are eligible to retire. A third of my maintenance supervisory staff is eligible to retire. 40% of the engineers, the Washington State DOT, won't be there 5 years from now. And so what are we doing to replace that talent pool? The engineers at WSDOT make 35 to 40% less than their counterparts who work as engineers for local government, not the private sector, local government. So I'm competing for talent with entities that can offer 40% more in wages. And that's engineers, that's planners, that's financial analysts. You try to find a data analyst. I'm competing with Microsoft and Amazon and Alaska Airlines and all of the big businesses in the Central Puget Sound for talent to keep our system up and running and to advance it. We need to get men and women into the construction trades. It's good, solid family wage work, and yet we have incredible shortages. Our apprenticeship programs and the investments we're making in pre-apprenticeship support services are beginning to make a difference. We just did something recently with the iron workers where we were taking young men and women who were aging out of juvenile justice and the foster care system, and we were running them through an apprenticeship to become an iron worker, and wrapping that apprenticeship program around that. We put first and last month's rent in a security deposit. So they were coming out of that program with a union job as an iron worker in a strong economy and a place to live, which everybody's, you're spending that kind of money? Well, it's a lot better investment than corrections, you know. And so we need to be thinking differently, all of us, about how we populate the entities that drive our transportation system that enable our economy. That's what keeps me up at night.
Well, appreciate that. And just to give everybody a scale, you have what, 7,000 employees, Roger?
That's correct.
So a lot of people power here that is really important, and we need to stay competitive doing that so that we can all stay competitive doing what we're doing in the business community or other governments. So Laura, I think we have a few minutes for quick questions if we have them.
Almost right at time, but but if we have one or two quick questions, I am happy to take them. Just step up to the mic.
Any questions from folks? Oh, Irene, yes.
Hi, everybody. I guess what I'm wondering about, we talked a lot about funding and things like that. And Secretary Millar, you put forward a vision for how we really need to transform our transportation system to the current one where we're very focused on roads and cars to one where we're moving with more mass transit. And we've obviously worked a lot on high-speed rail together and things like that. But one of the things I've noticed in the years I've been doing this work is that we're in this sort of zero-sum game situation where the current system is competing with the new system, or I should say the new system is competing with the current system for funding. Everybody's relying on the current system, and so it becomes really hard to invest in the new system when you then feel like you're depriving the current system, which is what everybody's using. And so I'm sort of wondering about how in this state, our funding on transportation compares to other states, not that they necessarily have it all figured out, but I'm wondering, it just seems like if we're going to transition to this new future, we probably need to invest more than we are now. And I'm wondering how we stack up relative to other states and what you all think about that dilemma that we're in at the moment. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Irene. Plenifish from Microsoft. Roger, you want to take that?
I'll take a stab at it. A lot of my colleagues who run departments of transportation in other states are relying on federal funding for over half of what they do. And the state money they raise, they raise enough state gas tax to pay the local match on the federal money they get. And that's all they're doing. Now, Washington State, the legislature stepped up 3 times with the Nickel Act, the Transportation Partnerships Act, and Connecting Washington. We have one of the higher gas taxes in the country. It's being invested in a lot of stuff, but Irene raised a very valid point. It takes real courage to pivot and say, look, we have come to realize, and I get a lot of grief for this, but we cannot build our way out of our congestion problems. We simply cannot. I asked the team to look at what it would take to do that in the Central Puget Sound. It's billions of dollars that we don't have, and all you would have to do that over about a 10-year period is raise a $2.50 a gallon gas tax. That's not going to happen. And if it did happen, we don't have the land, we don't have the watershed, we don't have the airshed. What we have to find is the political will to recognize that we're at a dead end and we need to pivot. And part of that pivoting is preserving and maintaining what we've got, and then envisioning the system of the future and starting to make those investments.
Great. Thanks, Roger. Kent or Jim, anything you want to add there?
Kent?
Well, yeah, I can add. I was waiting on you, but that's the struggle that I see. Your question about trying to get on a new horse when you still got to ride the one that you're on. It is a dilemma that we're struggling with. I think to me the best model is to take the total sum of the dollars that you have and then figure out some type of percentage, that you're going to invest on the current horse because it's going to die and do. So you got to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep it living. We're going to, we know it's going to go out, and then take maybe the lion's share of the dollars that you have and then invest that in the new. Now, the question I have about the new is, what is it? and I don't think that we have answered that question yet. We're still trying to figure it out. I mean, Jim's doing a lot of good work around, autonomous vehicles and things like that, but we don't know what it is. It's the Star Wars and Jetsons and stuff like that. We can visualize it, cognitively, but I don't think that we can put our hand on it. And so some of those dollars that we talk about investing in the new has to be around research and about bringing about pilots and bringing about something that is doable and workable. But it's a risk, and to Roger's point, we've got to suck it up, and that's a technical term, and just make it happen. So.
Agreed, absolutely. Jim, any last word from you?
Actually, I think Kent said it all. That was perfect, Kent. I couldn't agree with you more. It's time for us to step up and fund this program properly.
Great.
Yeah, I have heard a lot of people talk about the freedom the automobile provides them, and see the USA and your Chevrolet and those pictures, the car ads where everybody's exceeding the speed limit and driving all aggressively and stuff like that. I think about freedom in my car when I'm stuck in the 5 curves at the rush hour. About freedom in my car when somebody invites me to a meeting in Bellevue on Friday at 3 in the afternoon. There are other ways that we could do this, smarter ways that we could do this. There are models out there, and I think we're up to the task.
Agreed. Well, I want to say thank you to my panelists. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, Laura, for having us. And I think we're off to lunch.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody. Let's thank our panelists.